For 3 weeks, the small town of Cedar Falls had been terrorized by a serial arsonist, who seemed to know exactly when the volunteer fire department would be away on calls. But what the arsonist didn't know was that Spottie, a retired fire dog, with 30 years of experience, was conducting his own investigation, and he was about to uncover a truth that would shock the entire community. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills of Cedar Falls, a picturesque town of 2,400 residents nestled in the heart of rural Montana. Main streets stretched for 8 blocks, lined with family-owned businesses that had served the community for generations. Murphy's Hardware, established 1952. Sarah's Diner, famous for its apple pie. And the Cedar Falls Fire Station, a red brick building that had stood as the town's guardian for over 60 years. Inside the fire station, retired Fire Chief Joe Martinez sat in his old office, now converted into a community meeting room, studying a collection of incident reports spread across the worn wooden desk. At 72 years old, Joe's weathered hands still bore the calluses of 3 decades fighting fires, and his sharp blue eyes held the wisdom that came from saving lives when others ran from danger. Beside his chair lay Spottie, a 13-year-old Dalmatian whose black spots had faded to gray around the edges, but whose alert brown eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had made him one of the most successful fire dogs in Montana's history. Spottie's career had spanned 8 years of active duty, during which he had helped locate victims in smoke-filled buildings, detected accelerants at arson scenes, and served as the beloved mascot of the Cedar Falls Fire Department. The bond between Joe and Spottie had been forged through countless emergencies, from house fires that threatened families to wildfires that endangered the entire community. They had developed an almost telepathic communication, with Joe able to read Spottie's body language like a roadmap to hidden dangers, and Spottie responding to Joe's subtle commands with the precision of a seasoned professional. Now, 5 years into retirement, they found themselves facing the most challenging case of their careers. Cedar Falls was under siege by a serial arsonist whose pattern was becoming increasingly bold and dangerous. What had started as small brush fires on the outskirts of town had escalated to structural fires that threatened lives and property. The pattern was clear to Joe's experienced eye. Every major fire had occurred when the volunteer fire department was responding to what later proved to be false alarms on the opposite side of town. Someone with intimate knowledge of fire department protocols was using their inside information to create devastating distractions that left the real targets vulnerable. 3 weeks, boy, Joe murmured to Spottie, who lifted his head at the sound of his partner's voice. 3 weeks and 4 fires. Whoever's doing this knows our response times, our personnel schedules, and our equipment limitations. Spottie stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, his nose pressed against the glass as he scanned the morning activity. His behavior had become increasingly restless since the fires had started, and Joe recognized the signs of a working dog who sensed danger but couldn't yet identify its source. The first fire had been dismissed as an accident. Old Peterson's hay barn, struck by lightning during a summer storm. But Joe's instincts had been triggered by small details that didn't fit the official explanation. The burn pattern was wrong for a lightning strike, and Spottie had exhibited alert behavior around the perimeter that suggested the presence of accelerants. The second fire had been more suspicious. The abandoned Johnson farmhouse, supposedly ignited by homeless transients seeking shelter. But the fire had spread too quickly and too uniformly for an accidental ignition. And again, Spottie had detected scent traces that the human investigators had missed. The third fire had removed all doubt from Joe's mind. The Murphy family storage shed had been torched while the fire department was responding to a reported structure fire 15 miles away, a call that turned out to be completely fabricated. By the time the trucks returned to town, the shed was beyond saving. and only the rapid response of neighbors with garden hoses had prevented the fire from spreading to the Murphy home, where 3 young children slept. But it was the 4th fire that had convinced Joe that Cedar Falls was dealing with a dangerous escalation. The old Miller barn, a century-old landmark that housed the town's antique fire engine used in parades and community events, had been deliberately targeted. The arsonist had used accelerants to ensure rapid ignition and had chosen a time when most of the town was asleep. Joe had arrived at the Miller barn fire before the official response team, alerted by his neighbor who had seen the glow on the horizon. What he found there had chilled him to the bone. Clear evidence of professional fire-setting techniques, including multiple ignition points and the use of timing devices to delay ignition until after the arsonist had left the scene. But Spottie had detected something even more disturbing. The dog's behavior around the fire scene had been different from his previous alerts, more agitated, more focused, as if he recognized not just the presence of accelerants, but the specific scent signature of the person who had used them. "You know who did this, don't you, boy?" Joe had whispered to Spottie as they stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the volunteer firefighters battle the blaze. Spottie's response had been to move systematically around the perimeter, his nose working overtime as he cataloged scent information that his human partner couldn't access. Now, sitting in the converted office at the fire station, Joe was reviewing everything they knew about the pattern of attacks. The arsonist was escalating in both frequency and boldness, moving from isolated targets to structures closer to populated areas. If the pattern continued, it was only a matter of time before someone was hurt or killed. The door to the office opened quietly, and Sarah Murphy entered, carrying a tray with coffee and homemade cookies. At 45, Sarah had lived in Cedar Falls her entire life and had known Joe since she was a child playing in her father's hardware store. Her storage shed had been the 3rd target, and the near miss with her children's safety had left her both grateful and determined to help catch the person responsible. "Any new insights from your investigation?" Sarah asked, setting the tray on the desk and reaching down to pet Spottie, who responded with a gentle tail wag. Joe looked up from the reports, his expression serious but hopeful. "Spottie's been picking up consistent scent traces at every fire scene. He's tracking something or someone that the official investigators have missed." Sarah sat down across from Joe, her eyes reflecting the worry that had become common among Cedar Falls residents since the fires had started. "The whole town's scared, Joe. People are installing security cameras, organizing neighborhood watch groups, and some families are even talking about leaving until this person is caught." The reality of Sarah's words hit Joe hard. Cedar Falls had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes safely through the neighborhoods. The fear that now gripped the community was changing the fundamental character of the town he had spent his life protecting. "We're going to catch this person, Sarah," Joe said firmly, his hand automatically reaching down to scratch behind Spottie's ears. "Spottie and I may be retired from active duty, but we're not retired from protecting this community." As if summoned by their conversation, the fire station's emergency radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a reported structure fire at 1247 Oak Street. Repeat structure fire at 1247 Oak Street." Joe's blood ran cold. Oak Street was in the heart of the residential district, lined with family homes where young couples were raising children and elderly residents had lived for decades. If the arsonist had moved to targeting occupied residences, the stakes had just become life and death. Spottie was already on his feet, his body tense with the alertness that had defined his years of active service. Despite his retirement, the dog's instincts remained sharp, and the sound of the emergency dispatch had triggered all of his professional responses. "Sarah, I need you to call the sheriff's department and tell them Joe Martinez and Spottie are." Responding as observers, Joe said, grabbing his old fire department jacket from the hook by the door. "Tell them we may have information relevant to their arson investigation." The drive to Oak Street took only 4 minutes, but Joe could see the orange glow reflecting off the clouds before they were halfway there. This fire was bigger than the previous ones, and his experienced eye could tell from the color and intensity of the flames that accelerants had been used liberally. The scene that greeted them was controlled chaos. The volunteer fire department had responded with both of their trucks, and firefighters were already deploying hoses and establishing a perimeter around the burning house. But what made Joe's heart sink was the sight of neighbors standing in their yards, watching their community burn while clutching their children and looking toward their own homes with obvious fear. The house at 1247 Oak Street belonged to the Wilson family, Tom Wilson, who worked at the grain elevator, his wife Lisa, who taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary, and their 2 young daughters, ages 6 and 8. Joe's relief at seeing the entire family standing safely across the street was tempered by his recognition that the arsonist had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Spottie was pulling toward the fire scene, his nose working frantically as he processed the overwhelming scent information. But Joe noticed that the dog's attention wasn't focused on the burning house instead. Spottie was looking toward the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the firefighting efforts. "What are you picking up, boy?" Joe asked quietly, following Spottie's gaze toward the assembled residents. The dog's behavior was different from his previous fire scene alerts. Instead of focusing on accelerant residue or burn patterns, Spottie seemed to be tracking a specific person in the crowd. Sheriff Deputy Maria Santos approached Joe and Spottie, her expression reflecting the stress of investigating a crime that was terrorizing her community. Maria had worked with Joe on several arson cases during his active years, and she trusted both his experience and Spottie's abilities. "Joe, I'm glad you're here," Maria said, her voice tight with concern. "This is escalating beyond what our department can handle. We're going to have to call in state investigators and probably the FBI if this continues." Joe nodded, but his attention was divided between Maria's briefing and Spottie's increasingly agitated behavior. The dog was pulling steadily toward a specific area of the crowd, his body language indicating that he had detected something significant. "Maria, Spottie's tracking something," Joe said quietly. "He's been picking up consistent scent signatures at every fire scene, and right now he's focused on someone in this crowd." Maria's hand instinctively moved to her service weapon, though she kept her movement subtle to avoid alarming the crowd. "Show me where he's leading." Joe allowed Spottie to guide them through the assembled neighbors, the dog's nose working continuously, as he filtered through the complex mixture of smoke, fear, and human scents. But as they moved closer to Spottie's target, Joe began to recognize the specific individuals. The dog was approaching. Standing slightly apart from the main crowd was a small group of volunteer firefighters who had arrived early and were now watching their colleagues battle the blaze. Among them was Danny Fletcher, a 28-year-old volunteer who had joined the department 2 years earlier and had quickly become known for his dedication and knowledge of fire suppression techniques. Spottie's alert behavior intensified as they approached Danny, and Joe felt a cold recognition settle in his stomach. Danny Fletcher had been present at every fire scene, ostensibly as part of the volunteer response team. He had intimate knowledge of department protocols, response times, and personnel schedules, and his background included training in fire suppression, techniques that would naturally include knowledge of how fires started and spread. But what made Joe's suspicion crystallize into certainty was Spottie's reaction to Danny's gear. The dog's nose was focused specifically on Danny's turnout coat and boots, equipment that would have retained scent traces from close contact with accelerants and fire scenes. "Maria," Joe said quietly, positioning himself so that his body blocked Danny's view of their conversation, "I think we need to have a conversation with Danny Fletcher." Maria's eyes widened slightly as she processed the implications, but her training kicked in immediately. "Joe, are you certain about this?" Danny's been one of our most reliable volunteers. Spottie's never been wrong about scent identification. Joe replied, watching as the dog continued to focus on Danny with laser intensity. And the pattern fits. Danny would know exactly when and where to create diversions to maximize his opportunities. As if sensing the attention focused on him, Danny Fletcher looked up from his conversation with the other volunteers. For just a moment, his eyes met Joe's, and Joe saw something flicker across the young man's face: recognition, calculation, and what might have been fear. Danny's reaction confirmed Joe's suspicions. The young volunteer's body language changed immediately, shifting from casual observation to subtle preparation for flight. His eyes darted toward the edge of the crowd, calculating escape routes with a quick assessment of someone who had planned for this possibility. But Danny had underestimated Spottie's training and determination. The moment Danny took his first step away from the group, Spottie moved into a blocking position, his body low and his attention completely focused on preventing the suspect from escaping. "Danny Fletcher," Maria called out, her voice carrying the authority of her badge while remaining calm enough to avoid panicking the crowd. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Danny's response was immediate and telling. Instead of complying with the deputy's request, he broke into a run, pushing through the crowd of neighbors and heading toward the dark residential streets that offered potential escape routes. But Danny had made a critical error in judgment. He was running from a fire dog whose tracking abilities had been honed. Through 8 years of finding people in smoke-filled buildings and dangerous environments, Spottie's pursuit was relentless and professional, with Joe following close behind despite his 72 years. The chase led through 3 residential blocks, with Danny using his knowledge of the neighborhood to attempt evasion through backyards and between houses. But Spottie's superior senses and conditioning gradually closed the distance. And when Danny attempted to climb a fence separating 2 properties, the dog's powerful leap brought him down. When Maria and the backup deputies arrived at the scene, they found Danny Fletcher on the ground with Spottie standing guard over him, the dog's training having kicked in to prevent any further escape attempts. In Danny's truck, parked 2 blocks away from the Wilson House fire, investigators found accelerants, timing devices, and a detailed map of Cedar Falls with potential targets marked in red ink. The interrogation that followed revealed a disturbing picture of resentment and escalating violence. Danny Fletcher had been passed over for promotion to paid firefighter status in favor of candidates with more experience and training. His subsequent rejection by the fire department's leadership had festered into a bitter desire for revenge against the community that had failed to recognize his value. But what truly chilled the investigators was Danny's plan for escalation. The map in his truck showed that he had been systematically targeting structures of increasing importance to the community, with the ultimate goal of burning down the elementary school during a weekend when the building would be empty. But the psychological impact would be devastating. The whole thing was about showing them that they needed me, Danny confessed during his interrogation. "Every time there was a fire, I was the first one there, the one who worked hardest to put it out. I thought eventually they'd realize I was the most dedicated volunteer they had." The tragic irony of Danny's plan was that his arson activities had indeed demonstrated his fire suppression skills, but had also revealed a dangerous instability that made him completely unsuitable for professional firefighting responsibilities. During the trial that followed, Joe and Spottie were called as key witnesses, with their tracking and detection work providing crucial evidence that linked Danny to each of the fire scenes. The prosecutor emphasized that without the dog's exceptional abilities and Joe's experience in reading those abilities, Danny's escalating campaign of terror might have continued until someone was seriously injured or killed. The community response to the resolution of the arson case was overwhelming. Joe and Spottie were honored at a town meeting where Mayor Patricia Coleman presented them with the key to the city and declared them honorary guardians of Cedar Falls. But for Joe, The most meaningful recognition came from the families whose homes and lives had been protected by their investigation. Tom and Lisa Wilson approached Joe after the ceremony, their 2 daughters in tow. "Mr. Martinez," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion, "we wanted to thank you and Spottie personally. Our girls were sleeping in that house when it caught fire. If you hadn't caught Danny when you did, who knows what might have happened next." Emma Wilson broke away from her parents and ran to Spottie, throwing her small arms around the dog's neck. "Thank you for catching the bad man," she whispered into his fur. Spottie's response was a gentle tail wag and the patient stillness that had made him beloved by children throughout his career. In the months that followed Danny Fletcher's conviction and sentencing to 15 years in prison, Cedar Falls slowly returned to its peaceful character. Security cameras were removed, neighborhood watch groups evolved into social clubs, and children once again rode their bikes freely through streets where parents no longer watched with fearful eyes. For Joe and Spottie, the successful resolution of the arson case marked not just the end of a dangerous threat to their community, but the culmination of a partnership that had spanned decades and saved countless lives. Their retirement had been transformed from a peaceful conclusion to their careers into a triumphant demonstration that experience, dedication, and the bond between human and animal could overcome any challenge. The Cedar Falls Fire Station now displays a permanent exhibit honoring Joe Martinez and Spottie, featuring photographs from their active years and a detailed account of their role in solving the arson case. But the most fitting tribute to their partnership is the restored antique fire engine that Danny Fletcher had tried to destroy in the Miller barn fire. Now fully operational and driven by Joe in every Cedar Falls parade, with Spottie riding proudly in the passenger seat. On quiet evenings, Joe and Spottie can still be found walking through the neighborhoods of Cedar Falls, the retired fire chief greeting neighbors while his spotted companion remains alert for any signs of trouble. Their presence serves as a living reminder that some bonds transcend official duties and that the instinct to protect and serve never truly retires. Local children who encounter them on these evening walks often ask Joe about Spottie's adventures. And Joe is always happy to share stories about the importance of teamwork, dedication, and listening to the wisdom that comes from experience. But the story he tells most often is about the night when a retired fire dog's nose for trouble saved an entire community from a threat that human investigators had failed to detect. The lesson of Joe and Spottie's partnership extends far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls. Their success in solving the arson case has been studied by law enforcement agencies and fire departments across the country, demonstrating the continued value of experienced personnel and the irreplaceable abilities that trained animals bring to public safety. As Joe often tells visitors to the fire station, Spottie and I were supposed to be retired, sitting on the porch and watching the world go by. But when your community needs you, retirement is just a state of mind. The real measure of a firefighter, whether human or canine, isn't how many years they serve, but how ready they are to answer the call when lives are on the line. Today, Cedar Falls stands as a testament to the power of community, the value of experience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog, who refused to let danger threaten the people they had spent their lives protecting. Danny Fletcher's attempt to destroy their peaceful town had instead revealed the strength and resilience that made Cedar Falls a place worth protecting. And Joe and Spottie had once again proven that heroes come in all forms, sometimes with badges and uniforms, and sometimes with spots and an unshakable determination to keep their family safe. This incredible story reminds us that the instinct to protect and serve never truly retires, and that some partnerships grow stronger with age rather than weaker. Joe and Spottie proved that experience and wisdom are irreplaceable tools in the fight against those who would harm our communities. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are hiding in plain sight. but the nose for trouble that comes from decades of service can detect threats that newer technologies and younger investigators might miss. Their triumph shows us that every community has hidden heroes ready to answer the call when courage is needed most. What other incredible stories of loyalty, courage, and partnerships that refuse to quit are waiting to be discovered? Subscribe for more emotional tales that will restore your faith in the power of dedication and the bonds that make us all safer.